Hello, boys and girls, and children of all ages who are watching this YouTube video. I'm coming to you today to read a story that my mother used to read to me as a child. And I very much enjoyed the story, the funny story of kids not being allowed to skate on a pond and then being allowed to. It is called Cranberry Christmas. They also have one that is called Cranberry Thanksgiving, and I will save that one for when Thanksgiving comes around again next year. This is just a fun little story for you to enjoy during Christmas, because I miss being able to see you in person because of the pandemic. So I hope you just enjoy this story and have fun with it and look at the pictures and see what you can find. Again, it's called Cranberry Christmas, and it's by Wende and Harry Devlin from the Aladdin books, the Macmillian Publishing Company of New York. And this book has been out since 1976. So it's a very old book, but it's a very cute and funny story. So let's listen together. Christmas was coming. Snow was on Cranberry Bog, the smell of pine in the wind, and the fresh water pond frozen smooth. Mr. Whiskers, looking out from his kitchen window, was deep in gloom. Christmas was only 3 days away, and his pond should have been filled with skaters. Skaters in bright sweaters, laughing with their scarves flying in the wind, and he should have been there teaching them all to twirl and do figure eights. But old Cyrus Grape had changed all that. He had moved next door to Mr. Whiskers, into the stone house on the rise, and claimed that the pond was on his land. Cyrus didn't like children. Whenever he saw them on the pond, he would hop on his sled and slide bumpity-bump down the hill. "Scat! Off my pond, or I'll have the sheriff after you," Cyrus would shout as he shook his cane and chased the skaters into the snowy banks. "It's my pond, you old scoundrel. Mine," Mr. Whiskers would boom back. But when the old sea captain searched through the attic, the desk, and the cellar of his little gray cottage, he could find nothing to prove that he owned the pond. He began to wonder if he did own the pond. Mr. Whiskers brooded. Cyrus Grape cackled, and the little children sadly hung up their skates. Today, there were new troubles for Mr. Whiskers. A letter from his persnickety sister Sarah in the city announced that she was coming for Christmas. And after the holidays, she expected him to come back to the city to live with her. "You can't take care of yourself. Your house looks like a shipwreck, and your money box is always empty," she scolded in her letter. Mr. Whiskers frowned. He liked the way he took care of himself. In the summer, he clammed and felt the water and sand on his bare feet. In the winter, he ice skated with the children all around him like a school of fish. To think of leaving Cranberry Port, the idea of living in the city with Sarah and her striped cat named Mr. Whiskers made Mr. Whiskers furious. Fuming, he took his troubles to Maggie and grandmother, who lived in a farmhouse on the other side of the dunes. "Suffering codfish, what can I do?" He waved his letter in the kitchen. When Grandmother heard Mr. Whisker's news, she held her head. A guest at Mr. Whisker's jumbled house. "You haven't borrowed my broom since summer," she chided. "I sweep in the spring," said Mr. Whiskers, looking at the ceiling. Grandmother shook her head. She and Maggie didn't waste time. Mr. Whiskers certainly needed help. In a few minutes, loaded with grandmother's soap and polish and bristling with brooms and brushes, all three took the path to Mr. Whisker's house over the dunes on the ocean side. They went to work. How they worked! Mr. Whiskers scrubbed the floor. Grandmother dusted and gave orders. "What's that behind the couch?" "Lobster pots," Mr. Whiskers answered. "What's this in the bathroom?" "My shell collection," growled Mr. Whiskers. "Out with them all," ordered Grandmother. Mr. Whiskers grumbled about persnickety sisters and certain grandmothers, but he did as he was told. It was the end of the second day of helping Mr. Whiskers that the accident happened. Maggie had trimmed the pine tree and baked her favorite cranberry cookies. She had just put the last pan away when she heard a loud crash in the pantry. Suddenly, there were Mr. Whisker's feet sticking right through the ceiling. Maggie raced upstairs. Poor Mr. Whiskers! With help from Maggie, he groaned and pulled himself up. It was then that Maggie spied the dusty black and gold box between the floor and the ceiling. Carefully, they pulled it out into the light. "A treasure, Mr. Whiskers," said Maggie with shining eyes. "Not in my house," sighed Mr. Whiskers as he carried the box downstairs. He was right. It was filled with photographs and dusty old papers. But long after Maggie left, Mr. Whiskers was still studying the papers in the orange light of the afternoon. He opened the last stiff parchment and began to smile. Then he slapped his knee and shouted, "Suffering codfish!" Christmas Eve brought a light snow to Cranberryport. The smell of the sea was in the air. Mr. Whisker's sister, a round, brown-eyed woman with a flowered bag, arrived from the train station in Cranberryport's only taxicab. Mr. Whiskers hugged her and introduced Sarah all around. She turned and stared at the cottage. "How clean your windows are, brother." "I love to shine the blinking things," he boomed. Grandmother sniffed and Maggie laughed. But when Sarah went inside the cottage, she could scarcely believe her eyes. She had never seen such a beautiful sight. The wooden table was polished and set with holly and red candles. And the Christmas tree, it was a celebration of seashells. There had been no money for ornaments, So Maggie and Mr. Whiskers had painted the seashell collection. It glistened with silver and gold. There were chains of snail shells, silver clam shells, and a golden starfish on top. Sarah clapped her hands. "Brother, you're a wonder." Mr. Whiskers smiled behind his whiskers. That night was a triumph from the supper of clam chowder, grandmother's famous bread, hot spiced cider, and Maggie's cranberry cookies, to singing of carols around the old piano. Mr. Whiskers pretended to cover his ears when grandmother trilled on the high notes. And there were gifts from the old sea captain, a sea-worn bottle, blue as sapphire, for grandmother, a giant pink shell for Maggie, and a small ivory box for Sarah. Sarah dipped into her flowered bag and presented her brother with a new red knitted scarf and mittens. It was midnight. As Maggie left, Mr. Whiskers whispered into her ear that the children of Cranberry Port should be at the pond at noon tomorrow. He winked in a most mysterious way. Christmas afternoon was cold and bright. Mr. Whiskers darted among the skaters and had just stopped to catch his breath when he heard the voice of Cyrus Grape. "Arrest them all, Sheriff." Behind Cyrus stood a tall man with a broad-brimmed hat. There were screams as the skaters fled in every direction, all except Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Whiskers pretended he hadn't heard a thing. He skated, he whirled, and then he stretched his arms and glided like a great black whiskered bird. Mr. Grape's face grew red. "Off to jail with you," Cyrus screeched, pulling the sheriff after Mr. Whiskers. "I am skating on my pond, you old fraud," cried Mr. Whiskers, turning and slowing down until he faced Cyrus Grape. Slowly, triumphantly, he reached into his pocket of his brass-buttoned coat and drew out a yellowed, red-sealed paper and waved it under Cyrus Grape's long nose. He handed it to the sheriff. The sheriff studied it carefully and looked at Mr. Grape. "This paper proves that the pond belongs to Mr. Whiskers," he said. And you, sir, are trespassing on Mr. Whiskers' pond." Cyrus Grape turned a deeper red and roared with rage. He wound his muffler around his face and started up the rise to his house, pulling his sled behind him. Mr. Whiskers turned to the children and raised his hand for silence. "My pond is yours to skate on whenever you like." Merry Christmas to everyone. The crowd cheered. Sarah whispered to him, "My goodness, you certainly can take care of yourself, and all of Cranberry Port, too." Mr. Whiskers offered his arm to Maggie for a turn on the ice. They skated off joyfully. "I am a wonder," he said to Maggie, and even the whiskers couldn't hide the smile on Mr. Whiskers' face. The end. And that is the story of Cranberry Christmas. I hope you enjoyed that story, that it brought you some excitement and some wonder and shows you how generous Mr. Whiskers was to let all those children skate on his pond. I hope that as we continue through December that you have a wonderful Christmas season and that you share what you have with others. I will see you back here next time for 2 other stories that I have for us for Christmas. Bye for now.